April 7, 1945. The East China Sea churns beneath the hull of the mightiest warship ever built. On the bridge of the Yamato, Vice Admiral Seiichi Ito stands motionless, his weathered face betraying no emotion as American aircraft darken the sky above. His eyes scan the horizon, not for escape, but for a miracle he knows will never come. Around him, the desperate din of anti-aircraft fire and shouted commands fills the air as the 72,000-ton behemoth shudders under the first torpedo strikes. "Continue the mission," he orders, voice steady despite the chaos. "We proceed to Okinawa as commanded." The admiral knows what the crew cannot fully comprehend, that the Imperial Japanese Navy's pride, this floating steel fortress carrying the largest naval guns ever mounted on a warship, has been dispatched on what the High Command has euphemistically called Operation Tengo. But among senior officers it carries another name, a sacrifice mission. Behind Ito stands Captain Kosaku Aruga, the Yamato's commanding officer. With grim determination, he watches as another wave of American planes descends. The mighty ship's 18-inch guns, designed to devastate enemy battleships from over 20 miles away, fire uselessly at targets too nimble, too numerous to hit. The special anti-aircraft beehive shells, each containing thousands of steel tubes filled with incendiary material, burst in spectacular but ineffective displays against the relentless American air assault. No one in the combined fleet headquarters knew that one admiral's final act of defiance that morning would shake the foundation of Japan's naval tradition to its core, a tradition that had evolved over centuries around the belief that a warrior's most honorable death came in battle, facing the enemy. But first, we must understand how the mightiest battleship ever constructed found itself on this suicide mission, a mission that would end with the Yamato firing not a single shell at an enemy ship. Takeshi Moritani was born in the small coastal village of Karakura in northern Japan in 1920. His father, a career naval officer who had fought in the Russo-Japanese War, filled young Takeshi's head with tales of heroic sea battles and Japan's stunning victory at Tsushima in 1905. That battle had established Japan as a naval power to be reckoned with, and inspired a generation of young men to pursue careers in the Imperial Japanese Navy. "My father would place wooden ships on the tatami mat floor," Moritani would later recall in his memoirs, and explain how Admiral Togo had crossed the Russian fleet's T, achieving a decisive tactical advantage. "I knew from that moment I would serve the Emperor at sea." Moritani entered the Imperial Naval Academy at Itajima in 1938, graduating near the top of his class. The academy, renowned for its rigorous training and emphasis on Bushido, the way of the warrior, shaped him into the model Japanese naval officer. Discipline, sacrifice, and unwavering loyalty to the Emperor were drilled into each midshipman daily. After graduation, Moritani served on several destroyers before being assigned to the battleship Yamato in 1943. By then, the tide of war had already begun to turn against Japan, though few would openly acknowledge it. The young officer's assignment to the Empire's most prestigious warship was both an honor and, unbeknownst to him, a tragic destiny. "When I first saw Yamato at anchor in Truk Lagoon," Moritani wrote, "I couldn't comprehend her scale. She seemed less a ship than a floating island of steel. The gun barrels of her main batteries were as wide as the height of a man. We believed her invincible, a fatal misconception." Moritani's immediate superior was Lieutenant Commander Hiroshi Sato, a gunnery officer who had helped develop the special Type 3 anti-aircraft shells. Sato was pragmatic, technically brilliant, but harbored private doubts about Japan's strategic direction. Still, like most Japanese officers, he kept these thoughts carefully concealed beneath a stoic dedication to duty. "Sato-san taught me that naval warfare was changing," Moritani noted. He would say, The future belongs to aircraft and submarines, not battleships. But we dared not speak such thoughts openly. The battleship remained the symbol of naval power, and Yamato was our greatest achievement. By early 1945, Moritani had risen to become a department head aboard Yamato, responsible for a damage control team. He had survived the Battle of the Philippine Sea and the disastrous Battle of Leyte Gulf, where the Imperial Navy suffered crippling losses. The Yamato had emerged from these engagements relatively intact, but the same could not be said for Japan's naval aviation and many of its other capital ships. For Moritani and his fellow officers, the war's trajectory had become painfully clear. American industrial might was producing ships, planes, and ammunition at a rate Japan could never match. Fuel shortages kept the remaining heavy ships of the Imperial Navy confined to port most of the time. Food rations aboard even the flagship Yamato had been reduced to barely sustainable levels. Yet surrender remained unthinkable. Japanese martial tradition offered only one honorable path when defeat loomed: to die fighting rather than face the shame of capitulation. This mindset would shape the fateful decisions leading to Yamato's final mission. To understand the strategic context of Yamato's final mission, we must examine the broader picture of the Pacific War by early 1945. The Americans had methodically advanced across the Pacific, seizing key island bases and establishing air and naval supremacy. The Philippines had fallen, and American bombers were now striking the Japanese home islands with increasing regularity. By March 1945, American forces were preparing for their next major offensive, the invasion of Okinawa. Located just 340 miles from the Japanese mainland, Okinawa represented the final stepping stone before an invasion of Japan itself. Both sides understood the island's strategic significance. On March 29, 1945. As American invasion forces approached Okinawa, Emperor Hirohito received a briefing on Japan's defensive preparations. The Army generals detailed their plans for a desperate defense of the island, including the use of kamikaze aircraft. According to multiple post-war accounts, the Emperor then asked a question that would seal Yamato's fate. But what about the Navy? What are they doing to assist in defending Okinawa? Have we no more ships? This imperial inquiry sent shockwaves through the Naval High Command. Admiral Suemu Toyota, Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet, understood the implication. The Navy could not be seen as abandoning the fight while the Army sacrificed itself on Okinawa. Something, anything, had to be done to demonstrate the Navy's commitment. The reality, however, was stark. Japan's once mighty fleet had been decimated. Aircraft carriers had been sunk or rendered useless by the loss of trained pilots. Destroyer forces had been whittled down through attrition. Fuel reserves were critically low, with priority given to kamikaze aircraft operations. All that remained as a significant fighting unit was a small force centered around the super battleship Yamato. And so, in the final days of March 1945, a plan was hastily conceived, Operation 10-Go. The Yamato, along with the light cruiser Yahagi and 8 destroyers, would steam to Okinawa, beach themselves, and fight as shore batteries until destroyed, their surviving crew members joining the island's defenders. The plan's architects knew it was militarily unsound. Vice Admiral Seiichi Ito, who would command the operation, initially refused to issue the sortie order, declaring it a wasteful death sentence for the crews. Admiral Ryunosuke Kusaka flew from Tokyo to the naval base at Tokuyama, specifically to convince the reluctant Ito to accept the mission. In a tense meeting on April 5th, the fleet's captains unanimously rejected the plan as wasteful and futile. It was only when Kusaka invoked the Emperor's implicit wish that Ito finally, reluctantly, acquiesced. This mission cannot succeed, Ito reportedly told his staff officers privately. But if the Emperor asks for the Navy's sacrifice, we shall give it." The strategic rationale offered to the ship's crews was that their mission would coincide with a massive kamikaze air assault, creating a diversion that would improve the success rate of the suicide aircraft. Few believed this justification, including the officers who concocted it. On April 6, 1945, as the Yamato and her escorts prepared to depart, a remarkable breach of protocol occurred. At Tokuyama Naval Base, officers openly discussed the mission's futility. The executive officer of Yamato organized an impromptu farewell party, during which many officers drank heavily, a tacit acknowledgment they were not expected to return. Meanwhile, American intelligence had already decoded Japanese naval transmissions describing Operation 10 Go. Admiral Raymond Spruance, commander of the U.S. Fifth Fleet, knew of the Yamato sortie before many of her own crew did. The Americans prepared a massive aerial response, understanding that this would likely mark the final act of Japan's surface navy. As dawn broke on April 6, 1945, the massive form of Yamato slipped out of Tokuyama Harbor, flanked by her smaller escorts. The sortie was observed by two American submarines, Threadfin and Hackleback, which immediately reported the movement to the American fleet. Oddly, these submarine reports were transmitted in uncoded form and were picked up by radio operators aboard the Japanese ships, an early indication that the Americans were supremely confident in their ability to intercept the force. On board Yamato, Admiral Ito stood on the bridge, watching Japan's coastline recede into the distance. Captain Aruga approached him and asked a question that revealed much about the mission's true nature. "Admiral, how much fuel did they give us?" Ito's reply was telling: enough to reach Okinawa, not enough to return. What the two officers could not know was that the base personnel at Tokuyama, in an act of quiet defiance, had secretly provided more fuel than ordered, though still not enough for a round trip. This small act of rebellion spoke volumes about how even loyal Japanese service members viewed the mission. As night fell, the Japanese force continued southward through the Bungo Strait, between the islands of Kyushu and Shikoku. Aboard Yamato, final battle preparations were made. Damage control teams ran drills. Gun crews checked their weapons. Junior officers distributed senenbari, 1,000-stitch belts made by women on the home front to protect their men in battle. The mood was somber but resolute. Lieutenant Commander Sato gathered his gun crews for a final briefing. "Tomorrow, we will face many American aircraft," he told them. "Our primary mission is to reach Okinawa. Conserve ammunition and fire only when you have a clear shot. We must make every shell count." In his cabin, Admiral Ito wrote a final letter to his family, then sealed it for delivery in the unlikely event any messenger survived to carry it home. Captain Aruga did the same. Neither man harbored illusions about their fate, yet both were determined to execute their duty with honor. Aboard the destroyer Yukikaze, Captain Masamichi Terauchi held his own officers' briefing. Unlike his counterparts on Yamato, Terauchi maintained a glimmer of hope. "Our mission is to escort Yamato to Okinawa," he told his officers, "but should she be lost, we are to rescue as many survivors as possible and withdraw. Not all of us are meant to die tomorrow." This subtle divergence in understanding the mission between those who saw it as a total sacrifice and those who believed some might return would have significant consequences in the battle to come. As the first light of dawn appeared on April 7, 1945, the Japanese force entered the East China Sea. They assumed a defensive formation with Yahagi in the lead, Yamato in the center, and the 8 destroyers forming a protective ring. Each ship maintained 1,500 meters distance from the others, making it difficult for aircraft to attack multiple vessels with a single bombing run. At 600 hours, lookouts spotted the first American scout planes, twin-engine PBM Mariner flying boats maintaining a discreet distance. Admiral Ito ordered a course change to the west, attempting to create the impression they were withdrawing. This deception failed. By 1000 hours it was clear the American scouts were not fooled. At 11:30, the Yamato fired her massive main batteries at the American aircraft, using special Type 3 Beehive anti-aircraft shells. These exotic munitions burst in mid-air, releasing thousands of incendiary tubes designed to create a lethal curtain of fire. But the American planes maintained too great a distance for these weapons to be effective. Realizing that stealth was no longer possible, Admiral Ito ordered the formation to resume its course toward Okinawa. His final hope was to reach the American fleet before carrier aircraft could mobilize in sufficient numbers to stop them. Unknown to Ito, Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher, commander of the American Task Force 58, had already ordered a massive strike. Shortly after 1000 hours, the carriers Hornet, Bennington, Belleau Wood, San Jacinto, Essex, Bunker Hill, Baton, and Hancock began launching aircraft. Within an hour, nearly 400 American planes, Hellcat and Corsair fighters, Helldiver dive bombers, and Avenger torpedo bombers, were airborne and heading toward Yamato's position. Meanwhile, Rear Admiral Morton Dio had formed a surface action group of American battleships to intercept the Japanese force if it evaded the air attack. Dio received a message from his superior. "We hope you will bring back a nice fish for breakfast." Dio was in the midst of replying when word came that Mitcher's aircraft had found the Japanese fleet. Disappointed that the Airedales would likely get all the glory, Dio finished his message with a prophetic line: "If the Pelicans haven't caught them all." By 12:20 hours, the American aircraft had located Yamato approximately 70 miles north of Okinawa. The Japanese spotted the incoming planes and increased speed, passing through a rain squall that provided momentary protection. But this reprieve was brief. At 12:34 hours, Yamato opened fire with her anti-aircraft batteries. The Japanese force took evasive action, while the American planes began their attack. The tactical doctrine was clear. The bombers would target the escort vessels, while the torpedo planes would concentrate on Yamato, approaching from her port side to increase the likelihood of capsizing the massive ship. The first wave struck at 12:37 hours. 2 armor-piercing bombs hit Yamato, starting fires. One torpedo struck the port side, causing flooding. The damage control teams, led by officers like Lieutenant Moritani, rushed to contain the damage. Aboard Yamato's bridge, Admiral Ito received the damage reports with stoic calm. The ship maintained its course and speed despite the hits. But this was merely the opening phase of the American attack. At 13:33 hours, a second wave of 110 aircraft from the carriers Yorktown, Intrepid, and Langley joined the assault. This time, all attacks concentrated on Yamato. 20 torpedo bombers approached from the port side, and 3 of their torpedoes struck in quick succession. The battleship took on another 3,000 tons of water and developed a 7-degree list to port. The damage control teams had already counter-flooded to starboard, but now faced a critical decision. The only option to correct the increasing list was to flood the starboard engine and boiler rooms, a desperate measure that would significantly reduce the ship's speed. Commander Jiro Nomura, Yamato's chief engineering officer, gave the order. Flood starboard engine room 2. Flood starboard boiler rooms 3 and 4. In the desperate rush to execute these orders, there was insufficient time to evacuate all personnel from these compartments. Hundreds of Yamato crewmen were drowned as a result of this counter-flooding. A tragic irony that their deaths came not directly from enemy action, but from their own damage control measures. By 13:42 hours, Yamato's speed had decreased to 10 knots, making her an easier target. 4 more torpedoes struck the port side. The list increased to 15 degrees and could no longer be corrected by counter-flooding. Power failures cascaded throughout the ship, disabling many of the anti-aircraft gun directors and forcing gun crews to aim and fire manually. On the bridge, Admiral Ito conferred quietly with Captain Aruga. Their conversation was overheard by a young communications officer, Ensign Hideo Fukushima, who later survived to record it. "The ship cannot be saved, Captain," Ito said. "Shall I give the order to abandon, Admiral?" Aruga asked. Ito shook his head. "Not yet. We continue the mission as long as the ship floats." Ispinle. This exchange revealed the conflict tearing at the hearts of Yamato's senior officers. Their duty to complete the mission collided with their responsibility to save the lives of their men, if possible. Tradition and the Bushido Code demanded they fight to the end, yet the futility of continuing was becoming increasingly apparent. By 1400 hours, with the list increasing to 20 degrees, Yamato's main battery of 18-inch guns could no longer be trained. The mighty ship that was designed to devastate enemy fleets had not fired a single shell at an enemy vessel. Instead, her enormous guns had been reduced to firing uselessly at aircraft far beyond their effective range. American planes continued to pound the stricken battleship. At 1402 hours, 3 bombs exploded amidships. Fires raged throughout the vessel, approaching the main magazines where thousands of tons of ammunition were stored. Only now did Admiral Ito finally give the order to abandon ship. But in a final act that spoke volumes about the Japanese martial code, he and Captain Aruga refused to leave. Ito retired to his flag cabin, while Aruga tied himself to the ship's binnacle, the housing that contained the compass. They had chosen to go down with their ship, following a tradition observed by naval officers for centuries. The abandonment order came too late for many of Yamato's crew. The ship's severe list made launching lifeboats on the port side impossible. Many men had to jump directly into the churning, oil-covered waters. Worse, because the order came after the ship had already begun to capsize, hundreds of sailors were trapped below decks with no chance of escape. At 1420 hours, Yamato capsized completely. Her massive hull rolled to port until her keel faced the sky. 3 minutes later, at 1423 hours, a catastrophic explosion tore through the dying ship. The fires had reached her main magazines. Survivors described an explosion so massive that it was seen and heard over 100 miles away in Kagoshima. A mushroom cloud rose almost 6 kilometers into the air. The Yamato, pride of the Imperial Japanese Navy and the most powerful battleship ever constructed, had vanished in an apocalyptic blast that vaporized much of her structure and sent the rest plunging 340 meters to the seafloor. Of her crew of over 3,000 men, only 269 survived. Admiral Ito, Captain Aruga, and most of Yamato's senior officers were lost. Lieutenant Moritani, who had been organizing damage control efforts until the final moments, was among the few officers who survived, plucked from the oil-slicked waters by the destroyer Yukikaze. The light cruiser Yahagi and 4 destroyers were also sunk in the battle. The remaining 4 destroyers, damaged but operational, rescued as many survivors as they could before withdrawing toward Japan. The Americans lost just 10 aircraft. Operation Tengo was over. The surface combat capability of the Imperial Japanese Navy had been shattered. The loss of Yamato marked not just the destruction of a ship, but the end of an era, the final proof that the age of the battleship had given way to the dominance of naval aviation. As the surviving Japanese destroyers limped back to port, the shocking reality of what had transpired began to sink in among the senior leadership in Tokyo. Admiral Toyota, who had authorized the mission, now faced the task of reporting its failure to the Emperor. Navy Minister Mitsumasa Yonai stood before Emperor Hirohito with downcast eyes. "Your Majesty, I regret to inform you that Operation Tengo has failed. The Yamato and 5 other vessels have been lost." The Emperor seemed not to comprehend at first. He peered at Yonai through his spectacles and asked, "What about the Navy? What is the status of our fleet?" Yonai's response was devastating in its stark honesty. "Your Majesty, there is no fleet. the Imperial Japanese Navy has ceased to exist as an effective fighting force. This exchange, recorded in the diaries of palace officials, marks one of the first moments when the full extent of Japan's military collapse became impossible to disguise, even to the emperor himself. In the days following Yamato's loss, a remarkable document circulated briefly among naval staff officers before being suppressed. Titled Analysis of Operation Tengo, it was written by Captain Mitsuji Endo, a naval strategist who had opposed the mission. The sacrifice of Yamato represents not heroism, but strategic bankruptcy, Endo wrote. We sent our finest ship and best men to die without purpose. A nation that wastes its resources so carelessly cannot hope to prevail in modern warfare. Such criticism, though privately shared by many officers, remained dangerous to express openly. The document was ordered destroyed, though copies survived in personal archives discovered after the war. Lieutenant Moritani, recovering from his ordeal at a naval hospital in Sasebo, recorded his own reflections. They told us we would die to protect our homeland, but in truth, we died to protect the honor of men who could not admit defeat. Yamato never fired her main guns at an enemy ship, not once in her final battle. What purpose did such a death serve? This question, what purpose did such a death serve, echoed through the surviving naval establishment. For some, the answer remained rooted in traditional concepts of honor and sacrifice. Admiral Takejiro Onishi, architect of the kamikaze program, insisted, the spirit of the warriors who perished with Yamato will inspire future generations. Their sacrifice transcends victory or defeat. But for others, particularly younger officers who had witnessed the wholesale destruction of Japan's naval power, a different perspective was emerging. Commander Tamechi Hara, who survived the sinking of the light cruiser Yahagi during the same operation, later wrote, "We died splendidly, but to no purpose. This was not strategy, but empty gesture." Perhaps most revealing were the words of Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa, who had commanded Japanese carrier forces at the Battle of the Philippine Sea. When informed of Yamato's loss, he reportedly said, "So ends the dream of Japanese sea power. We built the world's greatest battleship in an age when battleships no longer decided wars." This statement encapsulated the fundamental strategic error that had contributed to Japan's naval defeat, the misallocation of scarce resources to weapon systems that, while impressive, were already being rendered obsolete by advancing technology. The American perspective on Yamato's final mission was markedly different. Vice Admiral Mitcher, whose aircraft had executed the attack, commented in his action report, "The enemy vessels fought with the usual Japanese tenacity and determination, but were outclassed in all departments." This clinical assessment reflected the overwhelming material and technological superiority that the United States had achieved by 1945. American naval leaders viewed Operation Tengo not as a heroic last stand, but as a puzzling waste of valuable assets, the kind of irrational decision that reinforced their belief in inevitable victory. Admiral Chester Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet, expressed this view succinctly. The Japanese committed their remaining heavy surface forces to a mission that could not possibly succeed under the conditions of our air supremacy. The result was predictable and final. For the American pilots who participated in the attack, the experience was both terrifying and awe-inspiring. Lieutenant Keith Crenshaw, a torpedo bomber pilot from USS Essex, later recalled, "When Yamato exploded, it was like nothing I'd ever seen. The sea seemed to open up, and this mountain of fire rose higher than we were flying. It was terrible and magnificent at once." The Americans also noted the courage of their adversaries. Commander David McCampbell, the Navy's ace of aces, observed, "They knew they were doomed, but they fought to the end." You had to respect that kind of bravery, even in an enemy. This respect, however, was tempered by a growing conviction among American military leaders that Japanese willingness to undertake suicidal missions indicated a national psychology that might require extreme measures to overcome. The specter of massive casualties in an invasion of Japan's home islands, potentially including many more kamikaze attacks, would later influence the decision to use atomic weapons against Hiroshima and Nagasaki. As the war in the Pacific ground toward its conclusion in the summer of 1945, the full strategic significance of Yamato's demise became clear. The Imperial Japanese Navy, once the third most powerful in the world, had been reduced to a handful of small vessels without the fuel or capacity to influence the war's outcome. The survivors of Yamato's sinking, like Lieutenant Moritani, returned to a homeland increasingly devastated by American bombing. Food was scarce, civilian morale was collapsing, and yet the military leadership continued to prepare for a final defense of the home islands. Moritani was reassigned to coastal defense duties at Yokosuka Naval Base. There in July 1945, he encountered an old academy classmate, Lieutenant Commander Yoshida, who had served on the staff of Admiral Toyota during the planning of Operation Tengo. Their conversation, which Moritani recorded in his post-war memoir, reveals much about the changing attitudes within the junior officer corps. Was it true, Yoshida, that the high command knew Yamato could not reach Okinawa? Moritani asked. Yoshida looked away before answering. The probability of success was calculated at less than 1%, he admitted. But Admiral Toyota felt we had to demonstrate the Navy's fighting spirit. 3,000 men died for a demonstration. Moritani's voice was bitter. The alternative seemed worse, Yoshida replied, to do nothing while the Army fought alone on Okinawa, or to keep our ships safe in harbor until the Americans came to destroy them. Either way, the Navy's honor would be lost. And what good is honor to the dead? Moritani asked. To this, Yoshida had no answer. This conversation encapsulated the moral dilemma that haunted many Japanese naval officers in the war's aftermath. Had the sacrifice of Yamato and her crew served any purpose beyond satisfying traditional concepts of honor? If not, how should they reconcile themselves to such a costly futility? For many, like Moritani, the experience led to a profound reevaluation of the values that had shaped their military service. In the post-war years, he became an outspoken advocate for Japan's constitutional renunciation of war, arguing that true honor lay not in dying pointlessly for outdated ideals, but in living constructively for a peaceful future. Others, however, maintained that Yamato's final mission, while militarily unsuccessful, represented something essential about the Japanese spirit, a willingness to face overwhelming odds rather than surrender, a quality they believed would be crucial to Japan's post-war reconstruction. This debate continued long after the war ended. In 1965, on the 20th anniversary of Yamato's sinking, a reunion of survivors was held in Kure, the city where the great battleship had been constructed. By then, Japan had risen from the ashes of defeat to become an economic powerhouse, its transformation guided by principles very different from those that had sent Yamato to her doom. At that reunion, the aging Moritani addressed his former shipmates. We who survived have built a new Japan from the lessons of Yamato's fate. We learned that true strength comes not from magnificent weapons or glorious deaths, but from wisdom in their use. Yamato's guns never fired a shot in her final battle, yet her legacy speaks volumes, if we have ears to hear it. What was that legacy? Perhaps it was best expressed by Commander Hara, who survived the sinking of Yahagi in the same operation. In his post-war memoirs, he wrote, "The tragedy of Yamato was not that she was sunk, but that she was built at all. Japan poured precious resources into a weapon designed to fight the previous war, not the one we actually faced. No amount of courage could overcome such a strategic error. This assessment hints at a broader truth about warfare in the industrial age, that victory ultimately depends less on individual heroism than on the alignment of national strategy with technological reality. Yamato, magnificent as she was, represented a misalignment that proved fatal. The final word on Operation Tengo, however, belongs not to the strategists or the historians, but to those who lived it. Petty Officer Kiyoshi Mizuki, a gunner who survived the sinking, wrote in 1975, "For 30 years I have asked myself, why did Yamato die without firing her main guns? Now I understand. She died not in battle, but as a symbol, a sacrifice to ease the transition between the Japan that was and the Japan that would be. We who served aboard her were not just sailors, but unwitting actors in the final scene of an imperial drama." The curtain fell on Yamato, and when it rose again, a new Japan stood on the stage. This perspective, that Yamato's destruction marked not just a military defeat, but a cultural watershed, offers perhaps the most meaningful framework for understanding what happened in the East China Sea on April 7, 1945. The sinking of the world's largest battleship without her firing a single shell at an enemy ship symbolized the passing of one era and the dawn of another. Today, the wreck of Yamato lies 340 meters deep, about 80 miles southwest of Kyushu. Marine archaeologists have mapped her broken hull, still recognizable despite the catastrophic explosion that ended her life. The forward section lies upright on the seabed, while the aft portion is scattered over a wide area, a silent testament to the force of her final moments. For modern Japan, Yamato remains a complex symbol of technological achievement, of misguided strategy, of sacrificial courage, and of a national tragedy. Her story continues to inspire books, films, and animated series, many of which grapple with the questions her fate poses. When does honor become hubris? When does sacrifice become waste? When must tradition yield to reality? These questions transcend national boundaries and military contexts. They speak to universal dilemmas about leadership, resource allocation, and the human tendency to cling to familiar paradigms even as the world changes around us. Admiral Ito never had the chance to explain his thoughts as he stood on Yamato's bridge during those final hours. Did he recognize the futility of his mission, yet carry on out of duty? Did he harbor hope for an unlikely miracle? Or did he see himself as merely playing an assigned role in a drama whose ending was already written? We cannot know with certainty, but in his final message to Combined Fleet Headquarters, sent shortly before communications failed, he offered a clue. The cherry blossoms of Yamato fall, but their beauty endures in memory. This poetic reference to the Japanese cultural association between cherry blossoms and the brief, beautiful lives of warriors suggests that Ito had accepted and even embraced the symbolic nature of his mission. Yamato would die, but in a manner that upheld traditions valued by Japanese society for centuries. The tragedy, perhaps, was not that Yamato sank, but that she sank for symbolism rather than strategy, that thousands of lives were sacrificed not to achieve a military objective, but to demonstrate a cultural value. In the harsh calculus of modern warfare, such symbolism proved an unaffordable luxury. As we reflect on what Japanese commanders said when Yamato sank without firing a shot, perhaps the most telling words were those never spoken publicly: the private doubts, the recognition of futility, the questioning of orders that sent men to die for a cause already lost. These unspoken thoughts, revealed only in post-war memoirs and private correspondence, offer a more honest assessment than any official pronouncement. They remind us that behind the veil of military discipline and national mythology, leaders often recognize the truth, even as circumstance or culture prevents them from acknowledging it. This gap between what is known and what is said constitutes one of the great tragedies not just of Yamato's story, but of warfare throughout human history. Would you have ordered Yamato to sea, knowing she could not succeed? Would you have questioned such orders, risking disgrace but potentially saving thousands of lives? Or would you, like Admiral Ito, have stoically accepted your role in a national drama, steering your command toward certain destruction because tradition and duty demanded it? These questions have no easy answers, but by wrestling with them, we honor not just the memory of those who died aboard Yamato, but our own capacity to learn from their sacrifice, to recognize when courage must be tempered by wisdom, when tradition must yield to reality, and when the truly heroic act might be not to die gloriously, but to live purposefully for a better future. Share this story so others remember what courage really means, not just the courage to die for a cause, but the courage to question whether that cause is worthy of such a sacrifice.